A sweet Friday evening settled over downtown Raleigh like a gentle symphony. On the cobblestone street, golden light spilled from the windows of La Fontaine, a French restaurant famed for its expensive menu, fine wines, and an ambiance where even whispers could be heard. Inside, soft laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses and the faint sound of cutlery gliding across porcelain plates. In the corner of the room, an elderly pianist with silver hair played each note, flowing like wine slowly poured into a crystal glass. The air was filled with elegance and quiet satisfaction. Amidst that flow, a young black woman moved silently between the dining tables, her white apron hugging her slender waist, her hair neatly tied up her steps, so graceful, and it was as if she were dancing through the spaces in between. Her name was Imani Brooks, 23 years old, a girl with deep dark eyes, not from exhaustion, but because they held many things never spoken aloud. To most diners, she was just another server, polite, quiet, vanishing right after topping off a glass of water. But no one knew that just behind the staff door in a small room where an old dust-covered piano sat, Imani had once lived another life, a life that was only her and the keys. She used to dream of standing on a grand stage, dressed in an evening gown, playing Clair de Lune beneath lights that looked like moonlight. But reality did not indulge dreams. Rent, utility bills, and a credit card with a torn-up cover pulled her away from the music. La Fontaine wasn't a stage, but a grand piano was silent, proud, and forgotten in the corner just like her. And tonight, under the chandelier hanging down from the high ceiling in a room full of elite patrons, no one could have imagined that the girl carrying water, the one no one even called by name, would be the one to bring the entire room to silence. Not with power, not with wealth, but with a piece of music. The glass doors of La Fontaine swung open gently, as if they too sensed that the person entering was no ordinary guest. 3 men walked in, wearing expensive coats, their watches catching the metallic gleam of the ceiling lights. But the man in the center with a leisurely stride and a half-smile was the center of attention. Bradley Whitmore. That name was no stranger to Raleigh's wealthy circles. He was a financial investor, millionaire, and was frequently featured on magazine covers with headlines like "The Man Who Built His Fortune." Tall, neatly groomed Italian leather shoes, polished to perfection, but his eyes made people uneasy. Cold probing, always seeming to assess the value of everything, including people. Imani was adjusting a napkin on the table near the entrance when she heard footsteps pause behind her. She turned and their eyes met. In that brief moment, she didn't see a refined gentleman. She saw someone calculating, eyes that seemed to want to peel away her exterior to find the most profound weakness inside her. Bradley tilted his head and smiled faintly. No one in his group needed an introduction. The front desk staff had already bowed as soon as they saw them. A prime table near the mini-stage had been prepared, not because they had reserved it, but because they were always given default priority. Imani took a small step back to make room for them, then turned away. What an interesting evening, she heard Bradley's voice echo from behind. Perhaps we'll witness some talent tonight. He didn't say who, but Imani knew. His eyes were still tracking her every step like a patient predator. Imani carried a glass of water to table number 9, her lips still smiling as she always did. But in her mind, Bradley's voice echoed like an off-key note in the middle of a piano piece. She didn't know why he had taken an interest in her, but she knew his type. She had known since she was a child. Back then, she lived with her mother and younger sister in a cheap rental apartment on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. Her father left when Imani was still in the crib. Her mother, a night shift nurse, was both the pillar and the guiding light. She always woke up early to prepare their meals and left little notes stuck to the fridge. "Don't forget to wake your sister. My daughter believe in what you love." In that tiny home, there was one treasure no one could steal: an old piano with chipped wood and yellowed keys still capable of making music. It had been a gift from the older woman who lived downstairs, a former music teacher now hunched with age but still remembered every melody. Imani fell in love with the piano from the very first touch. While other kids played tag outside, she sat quietly on the stool using 2 fingers to copy melodies she heard from an old radio. A little more each day, one song at a time. She had no teacher, no sheet music, just her ears, her memory, and her heart. Gradually, she started playing at church hymns that made the wooden pews vibrate every Sunday morning. Then came school, where her music teacher once stood stunned after a performance and said she was born to play music. But praise couldn't pay tuition. Scholarship applications were sent and returned. And when her mother was hospitalized from overworking, Imani knew her dream of music would have to step aside for reality. She tucked her last sheet of music into a drawer, folded up the notebook of melodies, and moved to Raleigh, where the pay was better and there was a grand piano in the corner of La Fontaine. She didn't play often anymore, but every time she walked past that piano, even just a few seconds, her heart would still tremble like a key had been softly pressed. I haven't given up my dream. I'm just stepping back for now to survive. That's what she used to tell herself. But perhaps the dream had never left her. It was simply waiting for the right moment to speak again. Imani placed 2 glasses of red wine down on table number 4 with her usual calm. Her hands were steady, her steps firm, her gaze respectfully lowered, exactly as expected. But what awaited her at the following table had nothing to do with service or etiquette. The VIP table is in the middle of the room. Bradley Whitmore lounged in his chair like he owned the restaurant. He wasn't wearing a coat revealing a wristwatch worth the price of a car, and was mid-story about an investment deal that had gone south, leaving a CEO with nothing. The men around him were business people, lawyers, or simply men with money. They laughed like they'd already had too much expensive wine. Imani approached, ready to take their main course. Bradley stopped mid-sentence when he saw her. He tilted his head eyes on the name tag on her shirt. A crooked smile appeared. Imani, he said slowly, pronouncing each syllable as if tasting the name. That's an interesting name. Sounds like it holds something grand inside. Imani froze for just a second. She smiled gently and bowed. Thank you, sir. I'll bring your dish right away. She turned to walk away, but before she could step beyond the edge of the table, he let out another remark, this time more direct. You know, I've always been curious about servers. They were often students, failed artists, or people with hidden talents, like you. Imani stopped. Her heart skipped a beat. The space around the table grew strangely silent. One of the men chuckled, trying to ease the moment. Brad, are you starting your guess? The job game again. Bradley didn't take his eyes off Imani. Just curious. Who knows, maybe she's a pianist, waiting to be discovered. The comment sounded casual, almost like a compliment. But Imani could hear it clearly. It wasn't admiration. It was a branding stab, dressed in velvet words. She gave a faint smile and replied quietly, I'm just your server for tonight, sir. Then she walked away, her steps steady, not faltering, but a ripple had begun to rise inside. Bradley watched her go, swirling the wineglass gently in his hand. I think we've just found tonight's main event, he said, half joking, half serious, setting off another round of laughter at the table, filled with amusement and the anticipation of something unkind. Music played, wine was still poured, and dishes were still served. But at table number 6, the restaurant's central table, the atmosphere had shifted. No one said it aloud, but everyone could feel it. Something was forming like a low cloud crawling across the sea before a storm. Imani avoided Bradley's gaze as she returned with the bottle of red wine. She followed every protocol, precisely uncorking, with a silver puller pouring the host a sample first, then serving each guest. Bradley took a sip, set the glass down, then suddenly spoke, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Imani, you just said she only a server tonight, but I don't believe that." She froze, one hand still holding the bottle. "Excuse me, sir," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. Bradley leaned fully into his chair, that smirk still on his lips, like he had just hooked a fish in some twisted game. "You know, he said some people are born to stay in the background and some are born to be on stage. Looking at you, you used to dream of something bigger, didn't you?" Imani answered softly. "I think everyone has dreamed of something at some point, sir." A few people at the table chuckled, not because the comment was funny, but because of how she said it, as if she were trying to slip through the fine net being cast over her. But Bradley didn't let up. He slowly tapped his fingers on the table as if conducting a private symphony. "And if I'm guessing right, you are an artist. You play piano, don't you?" Imani stiffened. Though she'd never told a single guest she'd never touched the piano in the corner during working hours, somehow he knew, or he was gambling and hadn't expected to guess right. "I play a little," she said, keeping her tone neutral. Bradley immediately turned to his group, his eyes lighting up like a child discovering a new toy. I knew it. She's an artist. So who in this restaurant would like to hear a piece of music tonight? The whole table burst into a performative kind of laughter, spiked with alcohol and entitlement. A few guests at nearby tables turned their heads. Some of the staff at a distance cast cautious glances, but no one stepped in. No one dared. Imani gently tightened her grip around the neck of the wine bottle. "I'm sorry, but I am working," she said, bowing slightly. Bradley raised an eyebrow, then sneered. "I am not asking you to stop working. I am asking you to perform. If you truly have talent, then this is your stage." He pointed toward the grand piano in the corner where the soft light from the ceiling fell as if waiting for someone to take their place. Or he took a sip of wine. "Everything you've said so far was just fantasy." Something pretty to say. The air froze. The nearby tables had stopped using their cutlery. Everyone was listening now like they were watching a play from which they hadn't bought tickets but couldn't look away. Imani swallowed dryly. Her throat was so tight she couldn't speak right away. Inside her was to just hurt but fire, a small fire low and smouldering, and now it was catching. "He's not just insulting me," she thought. "He's trying to erase me." Imani stood still for several seconds. In her hand, the wine bottle felt twice as heavy. Her heartbeat was pounding like drums echoing in a room falling into silence. A sharp chuckle came from Bradley's table, not loud, but enough to trigger a chain of stares. Stares from strangers, reclining in velvet chairs, glasses in hand, their eyes filled with judgmental anticipation. Bradley propped his elbow on the table, his gaze like a sharp blade. I was right. All just words. Nothing real at all. Imani pressed her lips together. She wasn't a one for confrontation. She had stayed silent when she lost a shift because a regular asked for a different server. She had held back laughter after being called the wrong name 3 times in one evening. She had learned to bow her head to keep enough tips to pay next month's rent. But tonight something was different, because this time he wasn't just insulting her. He was laughing at the pain she had swallowed for years. She glanced at the piano in the corner of the room. Its polished black surface shimmered under the light, its white keys lined up perfectly, as if waiting for hands worthy of touching them. That wasn't just an instrument. It was a piece of her memory that she had buried for survival. The whispering started to ripple through the room. Some guests took out their phones, some snapped pictures, some pointed toward her as if waiting for a performance to begin. But this wasn't a theater. This was real life. And Imani stood on the edge between humiliation and reclaiming her dignity. She took a deep breath, set the bottle down on the nearest table, raised her head. Her eyes scanned the entire room, not to find allies, not to find an exit, but to find herself again. "All right," she said, not loudly but clearly. "I'll play." There was no applause, no cheers, only thick silence as if someone had just hit the mute button on the whole restaurant. Bradley leaned forward slightly, the corners of his mouth curving in satisfaction, as if he had won and lured his prey into the heart of the show he was directing. But he didn't know, in that exact moment, Imani was no longer a server. She strolled upright through the stares of people who had never bothered to remember her name. Each step toward the piano was a step away from fear. A rejection of every time she had been called invisible. She pulled out the bench, sat down, her fingers touched the keys cold like the first night she played the old upright piano in Charleston. And then, without announcement, the light above the chandelier cast itself down directly on where she sat. A silent spotlight. No one had touched the controls, but it was just enough to separate her from the rest of the world. Imani sat silently on the piano bench. Her back was straight, both feet flat on the floor, and her hands rested lightly on the keys, as if cradling a fragile soul about to awaken. No one said a word, not even Bradley, still leaning back in his chair, wineglass in hand, lips curled into a smirk, made a sound. But that smirk now held no trace of triumph, only doubt. Behind Imani was the entire restaurant. In front of her only 88 black and white keys. But to her, it wasn't just a piano. It was a journal, a witness, a place where she had once confessed everything she couldn't say out loud. She took a deep breath. The overhead light hit her forehead, highlighting the faint furrow in her brow, like she was speaking to an old friend she hadn't seen in years. And then she pressed the first key. A note as soft as breath, then the second, then the third. Claire de Lune. The piece she once performed at her school recital when she was 16, while her mother sat in the front row, hands clasped, eyes wet but smiling. The piece she used to practice over and over every night after work, even when her hands were raw from washing dishes. The piece she swore she'd never play again the day her final scholarship application was rejected. But tonight she played it as if she'd never stopped. The melody poured out hesitantly, initially, then slowly gained clarity, depth, and weight. It seeped into every grain of the wooden floor, every inch of pristine tablecloth, and every person frozen in place like a statue. She looked at no one, not the diners, not Bradley. She was looking inward through each keystroke, each note, each memory breaking free like a dam bursting. Each note was a scar, each transition is a longing, and every sustained chord a silent declaration: I never disappeared. I was waiting for a chance to be myself. No one moved, no one ate, phones were lowered. The once indifferent gazes had shifted into attention. Then silence, then awe. Bradley no longer smiled. The wineglass in his hand was slowly placed on the table. No one heard the clink of glass on wood, because at that moment all they could hear was the music, a sound so genuine that no one remembered she was a waitress. The pianist's notes bounced off the elegant wood-paneled walls, spreading like warm water across a room frozen by arrogance and apathy. Each note painted a journey, not needing words, not needing an introduction, just raw, unguarded emotion. Imani closed her eyes. Her fingers glided across the keys as if whispering to old memories. Her mother was on a night shift with dark circles under her eyes. The old piano creaks during humid weather. The scholarship rejection letter was placed neatly beside a cup of cold tea. She passed the piano at La Fontaine many times, heart aching but forced to smile. All of it now became sound. A melody soft as wind, deep as an old well, and sharp as a winter night with too few blankets. She wasn't playing to impress. Not to get back at Bradley, and certainly not to win. She was playing to come back to life. In that moment, she was no longer a server, no longer the 23-year-old black girl in a white uniform. She was an artist, a human being, a soul standing tall before the things that had once tried to make her bow. The room made no sound, no clinking utensils, no laughter. Only wide eyes, moist, red-rimmed, and filled with something profoundly different: respect. Bradley sat motionless. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't move. The smug grin on his face disappeared somewhere in the second minute of the piece. Now all that remained was a large chair holding a small man. Imani ended the piece with a gentle, simple chord, no showmanship, no flourish. Her hands came to rest on the keys' palms, slightly trembling, not from fear, but from the echo. A profound silence followed. People weren't even sure if the piece had ended. Then, like someone had restarted the heartbeat of the room, applause erupted. At first, just one person, then two, then the whole room rose to its feet. Applause thundered, bouncing from ceiling to floor, swelling into a wave that made Imani's eyes sting. She didn't turn around. She didn't bow. She lifted her hands from the keys, placed them gently in her lap, and looked up into the light, like someone who had just returned from being forgotten. Imani stood up. She didn't bow, smile, or gesture in thanks. She turned her back to the piano like someone who had just said the most important thing of her life and didn't need to repeat it. The entire room remained standing. No one told them to. They just kept clapping as if trying to redeem the silence they had shown at the beginning. The looks in their eyes were no longer scrutinizing, no longer asking, "Who is she?" Now they asked, "Why haven't we seen her before?" Imani strolled through the rows of tables. Her gaze met each person's. Some nodded quietly, some placed a hand gently on their chest, some just smiled and let the tears fall. She didn't seek out Bradley. But then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, her eyes met his at the exact moment when he didn't know where to look. Bradley Whitmore, millionaire businessman, the man who had walked into this place like he owned it, now sat motionless in his large chair, hands clasped on the table, eyes unfocused. The smirk he always wore was gone. In its place was something strange, a mix of confusion, shame, and perhaps buried deep down admiration he didn't want to admit. Imani said nothing. She gave a slight nod, a nod of peace. Not arrogance, not forgiveness, just "I don't need to prove anything to you. But now you've seen it for yourself." Bradley swallowed hard. Then, as if suddenly remembering he still had a role to play, he lifted his hand and clapped. A solitary applause, uneven, hollow. It sounded like even he wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing. But he knew he was no longer the center of attention. One of his companions at the table joined in reluctantly. The other avoided Imani's eyes altogether. Imani gave a gentle nod to the guests, who clapped with genuine warmth. Then she turned and walked toward the back, where her co-workers stood frozen behind the bar. A few held hands. One wiped away a tear, another pressed her lips together, nodding slowly, as if witnessing something sacred. None of them had ever heard her play before. And now they didn't just hear. They understood. Imani returned to the service area as if nothing had happened. No one asked her to, no one forced her to continue working. But she walked lightly, calmly, as if she had just folded a chapter of her life and was ready to turn the page. The atmosphere in La Fontaine was no longer the same. Soft voices gradually returned, the clink of dishes resumed, but everything felt different. Every movement seemed slower, more reverent. It was as if each person, each plate, and each whisper were trying not to disrupt whatever sacred thing had just occurred. Imani had changed, but not through some grand transformation, rather through a new way others looked at her. She poured water at table 12. An older woman gently placed her hand on Imani's. "You were extraordinary. I've never heard Claire de Lune touch the heart like that." At table 3, a young man whispered, "Don't let anyone dim that light, young lady." Imani nodded in thanks. She didn't say anything, but her smile, soft and full of confidence, was far different from her weary smile earlier that evening. At the bar, a co-worker handed her a glass of water, eyes shimmering. I always knew there was something special about you, but I didn't know it was this. She accepted the glass, tapped her fingernail lightly on its rim. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Bradley's table. He was still there, but whatever pride he'd walked in with had slipped in the music. Imani returned to her duties, clearing glasses, collecting dishes, and taking new orders. But this time every step carried its rhythm. Her stride was steadier, her gaze was higher. Her spine no longer bent beneath the invisible weight of doubting eyes. She no longer had to pretend to be small to stay safe. She had been seen, she had been heard, and for the first time in many years she had been recognized for exactly what made her who she was. Imani carefully placed a cup of hot coffee on table 7. The silver-haired man received it with both hands, then looked at her as if he were gazing at something precious. "Young lady," he said in a gentle, gravelly voice, "I have played music all my life, but tonight I finally understand why people call it art." Imani gave a soft smile, nodding in gratitude. She didn't know how often she had said thank you in the past 30 minutes, but each time it felt different because every look given to her carried its emotional weight, or wonder, remorse, or simply admiration. A young couple stood to leave at the table near the door, but before walking out, the woman paused and took Imani's hand. "We'll never forget tonight. Thank you for being brave." Imani responded with a tender gaze that allowed her entire self to be revealed without a shield for the first time. She had grown used to pitiful glances, the kind that glanced past, the kind that looked right through her as if she didn't exist. But today, every look was authentic. Every gaze saw her, saw the whole of Imani Brooks. Story, her pain, her strength, and the music that soaked her soul. She passed by the VIP section, which staff usually avoided to stay out of trouble with powerful people. Now they were the ones avoiding her eyes. No one asked for more wine. No one joked. They just sat quietly as if trying to digest not a meal, but a lesson. Bradley sat at the head of the table, his back slightly hunched, hands clasped together, eyes lowered toward the table's surface. As Imani approached to hand him the check, he looked up, and their eyes met. A direct gaze, no hostility, no mockery, just a silent question. "Who do you see me as now?" Bradley picked up the pen and signed. As he handed the check back, he spoke softly without looking at her. "You did well." Imani didn't respond. She accepted the receipt and nodded slightly. Not because she accepted the compliment, but because she knew a compliment could never undo the pride already stripped away. La Fontaine closed at 11:30. In the kitchen, all that remained were the sounds of running water knives tapping gently on cutting boards and tired shoes sliding across the tiled floor. But nothing felt finished outside the service area where the grand piano sat quietly under dim golden light. Imani stood at the entrance wearing a light coat and holding her canvas bag. She didn't head home right away, not out of reluctance, but because she needed to take a deep breath, the final breath of a night that had in some small way changed her life. No fans were waiting, no talent scouts standing outside with contracts. But on her phone was an unread message. "Hello, Imani. I am Marcus Hale, a music producer from Nashville. I was at La Fontaine tonight. I'd love to invite you to record a demo in my studio next week if you're available. I am not promising anything big, but I do believe your music deserves to be heard." Imani stared at the message for a long time, not because she doubted it, but because for the first time in years a real door had opened. And this time she wasn't afraid to walk through it. She walked back to her small apartment 4 blocks from the restaurant. In her hand was more tip money than she had ever made in a single shift, thanks to diners who had quietly left notes on their receipts. "Don T, give up. Your gift is real. Thank you for making us stop and listen." She opened the door to her modest room and turned on the light. The old upright piano in the corner, which had collected dust and faded into memory over the years, now seemed to glow. Imani set down her bag and removed her coat. Then, without a word, she sat at the bench, fingers brushing the keys, like reconnecting with a forgotten part of herself. No one was listening. No one stood to applaud. No one was watching her as an artist. And she didn't need them to, because for the first time after everything she knew, one thing with complete clarity. She had never been a lost waitress. She was an artist on a journey to reclaim herself. And the music rose again, not as resistance, not as a cry for help, but as the sound of life. The sound of trust. The sound of a heart opening and stepping into the light.